that there's an interest and that people do different things with that interest. We are seeing trials televised more and more. People are fascinated with the legal system. I had a request and I granted it. Nothing more, nothing less. But some of my rules and requirements were meant to make sure that nonetheless things were fair and impartial. Fair and impartial doesn't mean you're going to agree with everything that I do. Fair and impartial doesn't mean you're going to agree with how a jury decides this case, how it's investigated, how it's presented. There's a lot of law on evidence. There's a lot of case law, volumes of it, on what comes in, what doesn't come in. Some of those rules impacted evidence coming into this case. Other things are beyond my control, whether the state chooses to offer something or not, or whether your own attorneys choose to offer something or not. But a courtroom isn't a free-for-all either. I do my very best to ensure that relevant evidence comes into the courtroom and reliable evidence. So I sat through this case, 16 days of trial from beginning to end, not including sentencing and any of the things that happened following the conviction. 36 witnesses. We had 4 expert witnesses, 2 pathologists, a pharmacologist, and then a toxicologist. And they heard a lot about tetrahydrozoline. What I learned about tetrahydrozoline is how it affects the human body. I had the criminal complaint, obviously, all throughout this case, but until a case goes through the trial process, I don't really know what all is going to come in. I have a good idea, but I didn't know the breadth or the depth of it. I didn't know, other than filings, for example, with the medical examiner and the Daubert motions, that's the first time I really got a lot of that information with substance. And a lot of times I don't even have that information until there's a trial. But what did I learn? What is tetrahydrozoline? I think at its simplest, it's a sedative, right? It's a substance that when used as approved for eye drops or nasal spray, it constricts, right? So it helps people breathe who have nasal congestion, and it helps with redness in the eyes. It is not approved for oral use. What do we know from the literature that's out there that predates this case? Some of it obviously coming in around or even after, is that there's really only 2 types of ingestions that are seen in the literature: accidental or malicious. No known literature about people dying from voluntarily ingesting it for a suicide. Why is that? Because that's a big question that I think needs to be answered. And that's because I think it's the last way anyone would ever commit suicide, because of how it affects the human body. It makes people sick. You weren't the first person to think about tetrahydrozoline. There have been movies and even Law and Order episodes, or an episode that I happened to see at one point, where there's some poisoning. We know from Henry Spiller, your own witness, he encouraged the FBI to look into it or get it on a list because of its use related to sexual assaults, that malicious ingestion, right, a poisoning. But like I said, at its core, it's a sedative. And how does it affect the system? During Ms. Kacinko's testimony, she talked about how when ingested, and obviously unknowingly, right, it's odorless, it's tasteless, you can give it to someone without them ever knowing it, It can reduce inhibitions. It creates, causes someone to be lethargic. It has a significant impact when in large amounts that shouldn't be in one's system it's a CNS depressant, right? So ultimately it affects breathing and heart rate and brain functioning and can lead to death. After listening and seeing and reading through all the evidence, just like the jury did, and I don't know what they ultimately or why they ultimately concluded it's a homicide. They don't have to explain their verdict. They just render a verdict, all having to agree. But as I saw everything, I have to ask out loud. It's a rhetorical question, but were you poisoning Lynn Hernan all along, following your release from prison?
No.
I'm not asking for an answer. This is my time. So do not interrupt me. She got markedly sicker following your reinsertion in her life on a daily basis, ultimately ending